Europe once mocked Denmark's immigration crackdown as cruelty dressed up as policy. A landlord running the strictest lease on the block, brutal to get in, ruthless to evict, break a house rule, and you're gone. In 2019, Copenhagen wrote a legal target of 0 asylum seekers. By 2021, Denmark became the first EU country ordering Syrian refugees home to a safe Damascus. By 2024, Rome, Vienna, and Brussels were drafting the same lease. So how did Europe's mocked example become its blueprint? It started with an election most of Europe misread as noise. In June 2019, Mette Frederiksen became Denmark's prime minister, leading the Social Democrats, and instead of softening her party's line against a resurgent Danish right, she absorbed it, campaigning on border language once reserved for nationalist parties. Her government's signature move, the paradigm shift law, rewrote the basic legal meaning of a Danish residence permit. The Folketing had passed the paradigm shift bill in February 2019, 4 months before her election, 81 votes to 27, with her own Social Democrats backing it from opposition. A permit had always been understood, in Denmark and across the EU, as a step toward eventually staying. Frederiksen's law flipped that premise. A permit became a temporary status, valid only as long as danger persisted back home, built to expire the moment Copenhagen judged that home country safe again, with repatriation now the statute's explicit long-term goal instead of integration. It stunned Denmark's traditional allies on the European left, who had spent decades pointing to Copenhagen as proof that humane welfare politics and open borders could coexist. Expiring permits were the mechanism. The target Frederiksen's government set on top of it was the headline. Copenhagen published a legal goal of 0 spontaneous asylum applications by 2021, a number no sitting European government had ever written into policy before, treating a functioning asylum system not as a legal obligation, but as a failure to engineer out of existence. The United Nations and refugee advocacy groups didn't call this a tightening of existing rules. They called it a rupture with 50 years of Nordic asylum tradition, the moment the country that had built its reputation on welcome began writing exclusion directly into law. The party doing the writing came from the left, not the right, which is precisely why the shift landed as a shock rather than a predictable swing of the pendulum. Denmark had picked up a pen most European governments, worried about their own reputations, would not go near. Staying away from Denmark's methods didn't stop them from spreading inward. The same instinct for control that shaped its asylum law reshaped its own neighborhoods too, where the landlord logic Europe would later borrow first took physical form. A 2018 law created an official government list of what officials themselves branded ghetto areas, ranking neighborhoods against thresholds for ethnic composition, income, education, and crime, then publishing the results as a searchable annual index. The 2018 rollout branded one Denmark without parallel societies under Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen, named 29 areas on its first list, including Mjølnerparken and Vollsmose. Landing on that list was not symbolic. Families in a listed area were legally required to enroll their 1-year-olds in 25 hours a week of mandatory Danish values daycare, teaching language and cultural norms years before any other Danish child faced a classroom. 25 hours a week was the requirement. Refusing it carried a direct financial penalty. Families who did not comply risked losing their child welfare payments, the state reaching into a household budget to enforce cultural assimilation on a 1-year-old. The European Commission opened formal scrutiny into whether the law breached EU anti-discrimination rules, an unusual step against a founding member state, and much of the continent's press reached the same verdict independently. This was discrimination measured out by postcode, punishing an address rather than an action anyone had taken. Denmark defended the mechanism as integration by requirement rather than punishment, but the distinction did little to change how it read from outside the country. Denmark was no longer only tightening who got in the door. It was rewriting the house rules for tenants already living inside. Rewriting the rules for people already inside was one experiment. Testing that same instinct on people Denmark wanted gone entirely was the next, and it moved fast. In 2021, Denmark became the first EU country to formally declare the Damascus region of Syria safe enough for refugees to return to, a determination no other EU government was prepared to make while the Assad regime still held power. Officials in Copenhagen reviewed more than 900 cases tied to the Damascus governorate, the largest coordinated permit review any Nordic country had conducted. The Danish Immigration Service acted on its own declaration almost immediately, revoking residency permits from hundreds of Syrians, many of whom had lived in Denmark for years, built careers, learned the language, and raised children who had never known any other home. None of that mattered once the permits were revoked, and neither did the fact that Syria refused to take these people back. With deportation flights unable to land anywhere, Denmark did the only thing its own law still allowed. It held many of the rejected refugees indefinitely at the Sjælsmark Departure Center, a facility built for people the state had decided did not belong but had, in practice, nowhere left to send. Sjælsmark, a former barracks in Hørsholm north of Copenhagen, had operated as a departure center since 2015. Some residents were confined there more than 5 years. UNHCR and Amnesty International condemned the revocations publicly, arguing Damascus was neither safe nor stable enough to justify sending anyone back. Copenhagen's position was that safety is a technical, revisable judgment rather than a permanent guarantee, the framing that let the government revoke status without formally reversing its own asylum law. Denmark's lease had just evicted its tenants into a hallway with no door leading back out. That hallway with no door out was the plan's entire flaw, so Denmark went looking for a way to build one elsewhere. In June 2021, Danish lawmakers passed legislation authorizing something no EU member state had put into law before, transferring asylum seekers to third countries for processing, moving the whole application process outside Europe's borders and outside the reach of Danish courts. The bill passed 70 votes to 24, and Immigration Minister Mathias Tesfaye flew to Kigali that April to open the first direct talks with Rwanda. Denmark opened direct talks with Rwanda through 2021 and into 2022, floating an offshore processing center that would let Copenhagen outsource exactly the problem Sjælsmark could not solve, screening and holding people thousands of kilometers from Danish soil instead. Distance turned out to be easier to arrange than a signature. No binding agreement with Rwanda was ever finalized, and by the time momentum faded, the plan had simply stalled, without formal collapse or announcement. The idea didn't die so much as go dormant, waiting for the political climate elsewhere in Europe to catch up. The European Commission objected publicly at the time, calling unilateral externalization of asylum processing a violation of the EU's shared approach to migration, a rebuke aimed squarely at Copenhagen alone. Denmark shelved an idea it could not yet execute on its own. It had, without quite meaning to, drafted the exact policy the rest of the bloc would spend the next 3 years quietly circling back toward. Circling back would take years, but the numbers that justified it arrived almost immediately. Whatever Brussels thought of Denmark's methods, the results were never seriously in dispute. Denmark logged roughly 4,500 asylum applications in 2022. Germany, across the same 12 months, logged roughly 244,000, more than 50 times as many. Denmark's population is a fraction of Germany's, but even adjusted for that, the gap held up as one of the starkest in the bloc. Sweden, a Nordic neighbor of similar population, logged roughly 17,000 applications that year, and France logged more than 156,000. Danish officials pointed to it as proof their deterrence strategy worked as designed, and by 2022 and 2023, Denmark's asylum rate per capita ranked among the lowest in the European Union. A landlord who evicts fast and enforces every clause in the lease ends up with an empty building, and for Copenhagen, that emptiness was the entire point, not a side effect. An empty building, it turned out, makes a persuasive advertisement, and Britain was one of the first governments to come looking at the lease for itself. In 2022, the UK signed its own asylum processing deal with Rwanda, an offshore scheme that echoed the framework Denmark had floated barely a year earlier, right down to the choice of country. Then Home Secretary Priti Patel signed the memorandum in April 2022, committing £140 million to Kigali before any flight left British soil. The first was grounded that June. It did not survive contact with its own legal system for long. The UK Supreme Court ruled the scheme unlawful in November 2023, unanimously, on the grounds that Rwanda could not be relied upon to guarantee genuine refugees' safety once they arrived. Guaranteeing safety was the sticking point the court couldn't get past, and neither could the politics that followed. The incoming UK government scrapped the Rwanda plan entirely in July 2024, before a single flight had carried anyone to Kigali. The reversal cost Britain years of preparation and considerable money, spent building a policy its own legal system had already signaled it would not accept. Danish officials noted, not quietly, that Denmark had proposed something close to this year's before Britain ever attempted its own version. The tenant who copied the lease almost line for line got evicted by his own courts before he collected a month's rent from it. Getting evicted by the courts stopped Britain's version cold, on paper at least. Italy decided to see how far the same idea could go once it was poured in concrete instead of written in statute. Under Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Italy signed a migration deal with Albania in 2023 and did something Denmark and Britain had each only proposed. It physically built 2 detention centers on foreign soil, opening facilities at Schengen and Jadar in 2024, designed to process and hold migrants intercepted at sea before they set foot on Italian territory. Meloni signed the protocol with Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama that November, and Jadar, built on a converted military airbase, was designed to hold roughly 3,000 people at a time. The centers were built with capacity for thousands of transfers a year, a scale well beyond anything Denmark or Britain had actually attempted. Reaching Italian territory was exactly what the centers were built to prevent, and Italian judges would not let them operate as designed for long. Courts refused to validate the detentions there, repeatedly, starting in October 2024, sending detainee after detainee back to the mainland instead of holding them in the camps. The first group transferred that October numbered 12 men from Bangladesh and Egypt. A Rome tribunal ordered all 12 returned within 48 hours. The dispute was ultimately referred to the European Court of Justice for a binding ruling that could settle the question for the entire bloc at once. Italy had taken Denmark's lease and tried to put it in writing on land it did not govern, and its own legal system would not sign. That refusal didn't stop the idea from climbing to the top of the building anyway. In May 2024, interior ministers from 15 EU member states, spanning some of the bloc's largest economies, sent a joint letter pushing Brussels to formally explore what they called innovative return hub concepts located outside Europe entirely. The letter was coordinated by Denmark, Italy, Austria, and the Netherlands, with Poland, Czechia, and Greece among the 15 signatories. The European Commission responded by floating the actual legal groundwork for processing or return centers beyond EU borders. The very framework it had publicly objected to when Denmark floated the same idea alone 3 years earlier. It was, in effect, an admission that deterrence had become more politically valuable than the criticism it once drew. 3 years earlier, Denmark had been the one getting objected to. Now Denmark was the one being asked for its notes on how to do it. Mette Frederiksen, the same prime minister who had started this whole experiment in 2019, said plainly that EU-funded external migrant centers could become reality within a few years, naming 2027 as a plausible date for the first to open its doors. 15 governments were no longer mocking the landlord's methods from a distance. They were lining up to read the lease for themselves, clause by clause. Reading the lease was step 1. Denmark made sure it also got to write the next draft. From July to December 2025, Denmark held the rotating presidency of the EU Council, the seat built to broker consensus among all 27 member governments at once, and Frederiksen used those 6 months in the chair to push external migrant centers from a Danish national idea into a formal, bloc-wide agenda item with real institutional weight. Denmark's presidency program, published that July, listed migration management as one of just 3 formal priorities, alongside defense spending and competitiveness. A bloc-wide agenda item is not the same as a Danish talking point, and other governments made that shift explicit and public. Migration externalization stopped being one country's experiment and became a live policy discussion at the European level, with member state after member state pointing openly to Denmark's low asylum numbers as the case for adoption elsewhere. The outlier Europe had spent a decade wagging its finger at now held the gavel for the entire room. Holding the gavel does not settle the law, and this is exactly where the lease keeps hitting the same wall it hit back in Rome and Copenhagen. UNHCR and Human Rights Watch continue to maintain that externalized processing risks violating the international principle of non-refoulement, the basic obligation not to send anyone back into danger, a principle that predates the European Union by decades. The principle is codified in Article 33 of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which Denmark helped draft. European Court of Human Rights precedent still constrains any government from removing people to a country the court judges unsafe, regardless of what a national parliament has already voted to do. That constraint is not a technicality. It is the same legal backbone that has stopped removals to unsafe states for decades, in cases having nothing to do with migration policy. Regardless of what parliaments vote, judges have kept intervening, and the pattern has not broken once. Italy's centers in Albania remained legally contested throughout 2025, still unresolved, still largely empty of the population they were built to hold. No EU-wide legal framework for external return hubs has been adopted as this film is being told. The building has plenty of new tenants asking about the lease. Nobody has signed one yet that has survived a courtroom. Nobody signing a lease that survives court doesn't mean nobody is living under its terms right now, and that's true back where this story started too. At Sjælsmark, rejected asylum seekers still wait indefinitely whenever their home country refuses to take them back, held in a facility designed for weeks that has, for some residents, stretched into years with no end date. Denmark's ghetto law was formally renamed the Parallel Societies Law, a softer label wrapped around the same mechanism, and it still tracks the same listed neighborhoods toward a hard target set for 2030. The renaming took effect in December 2021, giving municipalities 2 additional years to hit redevelopment targets in flagged neighborhoods. A 2030 target means the mechanism hasn't finished its work. The law requires under 30% non-Western residency in every flagged area by that date, a demographic quota written directly into Danish housing policy. Whether that quota survives its own legal challenges by 2030 remains genuinely unresolved, in exactly the way the export version of this policy still is. Danish and international rights groups keep fighting both policies in court, year after year, without overturning either one outright. The success story Denmark exports to the rest of Europe rarely mentions the families still on that list, or the men still waiting at Sjælsmark for a flight that may never get booked. Waiting for a flight that may never come is the quiet cost underneath the headline numbers, and those numbers are what carried this story from a campaign promise to a continental proposal. It runs from a 2019 pledge of 0 asylum seekers to a 2027 proposal for EU-funded centers built outside Europe's borders, with Denmark's asylum numbers staying among the lowest in the bloc the entire distance between those 2 dates. Britain's attempt at the same idea, Italy's poured concrete version of it, and 15 interior ministers asking Brussels to formalize it are not separate stories that happen to be adjacent. They are the same lease being signed by tenant after tenant after tenant. None of that momentum required a single new court to rule in the policy's favor, only enough governments willing to ask the same question Denmark asked first. Denmark's 2025 presidency of the EU Council is what finally turned a national policy into a continental one, on the record. Europe, MOCKED, HEPL, E-Plan IT now Capais. Denmark wrote the strictest lease on the block while the rest of the continent called it cruelty, and now half of that continent wants the landlord's phone number. What Denmark actually exports is deterrence with a caseload attached. The families still on a list, the men still waiting at Sjælsmark, the judges in Rome and London still refusing to sign what their own politicians already agreed to on paper. Is deterrence that works this well worth the people it leaves stuck in the hallway? Or has Europe simply found a more efficient way to avoid asking that question at all? Tell me where you land in the comments. And if stories like this one are your kind of thing, subscribe for the next one.